Members of the committee, my name is Darren Gones. I'm the state liaison for the National Rifle Association. On behalf of our Rhode Island members, I'd like to go through some of the bills tonight that we oppose. There's a couple we support, and then there's also a couple that we have no position on. We're neutral. You're probably we've gone through this routine for at least the last 6 or 7 years that I've been here, so a lot of this I know gets redundant. And we know the arguments on a lot of these bills, so I'm going to try and hit some of the questions that have already been raised by some of the previous speakers and address those. Also, Frank Sosio with our state association is going to outline some of the bills, primarily because he was instrumental in providing language and drafting them and knows the ins and outs of them. The first one I'm probably going to start with, because it's generated the most discussion, is the 10-round magazine limit. It was interesting, the good representative who introduced the bill mentioned a couple states that had those limits. When asked, it's important to note that of the states that he listed, a couple of those states have 15-round magazine limits. So when you look at, and not that I'm advocating for that, but what I am saying is that when you look at Rhode Island going to 10 rounds, it would clearly be one of the more restrictive laws in the country. Placing it probably in the top 4 or 5 states. States like Colorado, New Jersey, even New Jersey's 15, and they have widely regarded as some of the most restrictive gun laws in the country. But really, a lot of this stuff isn't new. I've done this in 9 states over a dozen years, and these bills have popped up all over the country. They've popped up at the federal law. So, like anything in life, it's not new. It's not speculation how it works. We know what happens. In fact, the federal government had from 1994 to 2004 an assault weapons ban and a magazine capacity restriction ban. And after that was allowed to expire in 2004, the U.S. Justice Department was commissioned to do a study to look at the effectiveness of that. And it found out that the magazine capacity had no impact on crime. Now, it was no impact. It wasn't any better or it wasn't any worse. And the thing you look at in this country, there are, conservatively, I can't even say hundreds of thousands. It's in the millions of magazines. And some scenarios were presented that said, well, this will give folks pause during reloading to apparently subdue a guy with a gun. Now, this, of course, is assuming that someone goes into a school and says, I'm going in there with legal magazines. I'm going in there to kill everybody, but I sure want to be in compliance with the state's magazine capacity restriction, which of course we all know is absolutely absurd. And as pointed out earlier, Columbine was committed with legal magazines. So I understand the frustration. The frustration is, gee, there's got to be something we can do to legislate to fix this problem of gun violence in the country. But this is not the answer, because this is only going to apply to law-abiding citizens who follow the law. And something else, I live in New Jersey, and I've seen what these restrictions do. These restrictions do nothing. We have cities like Jersey City, Camden. We have some of the most violent cities in the country and some of the most drastic gun control laws. What it does is when someone who's 75 or 80 years old passes away and their family goes to deal with their estate, they find out that the guy who served in World War II has 15 and 30 round magazines. It's not the criminal that's being punished, because these criminals aren't going to say, I'm going to rob the 7-Eleven with a legal magazine. It's the guy, the law-abiding citizen who has this property that's overnight. They're turned into criminals. So absolutely, we're opposed to the 10-round magazine restriction. The other question that came up was on litigation. There is some disagreement in the federal courts, the U.S. federal courts. If you take New York's magazine restriction, which they actually lowered to 7, that limitation was overturned in the Federal Western District Court in Buffalo. Now, it reverted back to their previously existing limit of 10. But the limit of 7 was overturned, and the judge specifically said in that opinion that it was an arbitrary violation of the U.S. Constitution. As pointed out before, in the state of Rhode Island, as is the case with a lot of states, you also have state constitutional protections, which in many cases are stronger. The bottom line is this issue and the assault weapons issue is probably going to be litigated in the U.S. Supreme Court at some point in the future, because you have lower courts that are in disagreement. But I think it's easily lost that over 40 states don't have restrictions on magazines. We're talking about a small subset of states, and the irony is where these subsets of states have existed, they have some of the worst crime in the country. And I mean, whether it's Chicago or New Jersey, there are some large cities that have their own restrictions. They just simply don't work. But I've spent a lot of time on that bill, and I'm not going to spend nearly that amount of time on some of the other bills. Moving on to House Bill 5263 and House Bill 5547. Those are the youth bills. I'm going to lump them together because they're largely the same, with the exception that the bills describe a qualified adult as someone 18 versus 21. One is 18 and one is 21. This was one of the first bills that I worked on when I started working in the state of Rhode Island 6 or 7 years ago on this issue. My first comment was they're trying to remove and use, which is the element that shows criminal activity. Now, if you get rid of that and make the job easier for the prosecutor, okay, that's fine. But shouldn't we make the prosecutors do their job and prove that somebody actually did something wrong versus a kid who's going shooting or hunting and is legally transporting a firearm? Not to mention, there are, and this is going to play into the other bill, so I can reference a comment on that, with the transportation of long guns. The other thing that we need to realize is that Congress has already acted on some of these transportation rules under FOPA, which is the Fire Owners Protection Amendment, which is federal legislation that allows people to transport their firearms if they're unloaded and not easily acceptable. So some of this is going to interfere with federal law and those federal protections that are afforded to non-residents and residents. On that bill, which is 5262, I would also comment that you're getting into some very dicey ground when you're talking about transporting firearms. If you look at New Jersey, and again, I use that state a lot because A, I live there, B, I work there, and C, they have some of these draconian gun laws. So it's a good snapshot into how they work. But Governor Christie has already offered clemency and pardoned, I think it's approaching a dozen. It was at 7 last I checked, but it's only going up. In fact, there was one in recent weeks because folks come to New Jersey and they don't have the proper paperwork. Now, by proper paperwork, I'm talking about their state-issued card. They are properly licensed in their own state. But these folks are they're imprisoning, and they have a Graves Act there, so it's a 7-year minimum. They're literally imprisoning people for getting pulled over with a firearm. Some of these people, one of the gals, Shanine Allen, was a single black mother, worked in Philadelphia, actually had a concealed carry permit, was pulled over on the way to Atlantic City, offered to the officer that she had a concealed carry permit, and she was facing a 7-year felony under the Graves Act until we drew attention to that case, and there were some good Second Amendment lawyers that ended up getting involved in that case, but ultimately the governor had to intervene and offer some of these folks clemency. Now, the reason I bring all of this up is this is where it starts. This is the beginning of the discussion. That's the end of the discussion. That's where we'll go. And if you're going to be in the business of locking up law-abiding citizens, this is clearly the way to start out. But we wouldn't like to see all of that litigation and the fact that innocent people are being thrown in jail. So we want to focus on the criminals. And back to the youth bills. One of the comments that I made early on was that if you're having trouble prosecuting these cases, how many? I've challenged them year after year. How many times are these cases being thrown out because they can't prove the and use? Now, hopefully, Representative Casey's bill, which requires the AG to report some of these figures, is going to give some insight into that. But why they haven't shown, or at least quantified, the number of cases that they're unable to prosecute where a legitimate bad guy, a gang-affiliated member, for example, is not being able to be prosecuted under the statute. Because keep in mind, a lot of times when law enforcement pull these people over, there are other circumstances involved. They're in possession of drugs. They're in the commission of another crime. They're high. I mean, you can go on with a whole litany of circumstances, certainly enough for any prosecutor to prosecute them. The last bill, well, there's a couple that I'm just going to mention that we support. One would be the CCW, the Concealed Carry Reform Bill, which is House Bill 6039. And then I would also like to talk a little bit about House Bill 6040, which is the reciprocity bill. And the important thing to remember on reciprocity is a lot of this could change because there's federal legislation introduced right now which would give full faith and credit to concealed carry permits, much the same way we do to driver's license. And that legislation, depending on what the threshold, the vote threshold in the U.S. Senate is going to be, whether it's 60 or a simple majority, that bill has a very good chance of passing both chambers of Congress and being signed into law, which would, of course, create reciprocity among all 50 states. The other thing is this isn't some novel concept. Again, we've seen these agreements before, and how do they work? Well, 22 states actually have acting national reciprocity because they either recognize other states, meaning all other states, or they don't require non-resident citizens to have a license to carry at all. These are states that we call permitless carry, and that number started out at one or two. Vermont has always never required a permit, but then states like Arizona, Wyoming, and Alaska passed it, and now I think we're up to 12. It's over a dozen. So, and that number, and again, because the numbers, I'm not giving you strong numbers, it's because this is a very fluid situation. We're working on these bills in state houses as we speak, and the number is going up. It's gone up quite a bit in just the last 2 or 3 years. There have also been several bills that have cleared chambers, but were vetoed. So we're very optimistic that we're going to be hitting 20 on that very soon. With that, I would avail myself for any questions that the committee may have, if it pleases the chairman.
Vice Chair McKeny.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's see. I got to go back to the bill. It's Rettenberg's. 5155. You talked about the magazine capacities. Is there any kind of usual amount of rounds that a magazine can hold, or is there what do other states do? Do they have? I mean, this one says 10. Is it 50? Is it 100? I really don't know much about these high capacity, whatever they're called. Magazines and how many rounds they hold. So, I mean, I think the idea here is to limit, at least have a number. Maybe 10, in your view, might be too low, but do other states have a limit on how many rounds can be in a magazine?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, that is a good question. And the term high-capacity magazine was coined by folks that want to put restrictions on the magazines. They're really not high capacity, because what is high capacity? We call them standard capacity because that's what the firearm is sold with. For example, Glock, there's one that's sold with 15. There's some 1911s are sold with 7. It really depends on the firearm. And that's why if you do what they did in New York, which was lower the limit to 7, it was actually more than a magazine ban. It became a gun ban, because if the manufacturer only manufactures a standard capacity 10 or 15 round magazines, and you restricted it to 7, there's no magazine that's going to fit it.
So 15 is the usual number?
No, that's not usual at all. For example, most AR platforms, Magpul produce, among other companies, produce standard capacity magazines that are 30.
30. So are there any that are more than that? Are there any
Sure, there are 100-round drums. I mean,
but why would it begs the question: why would someone need to stockpile that much ammunition? It seems like a lot. Whether it's 100, 1,000.
Right.
No, it doesn't seem like that's normal activity for a gun, a law-abiding gun owner to just stockpile ammunition.
No, it's a legitimate question, and it's one we get often. So I think the easiest way to maybe make this clear is that you're a single mother at home, or I'm a single guy at home.
Sure.
Anybody. You're at home alone. 3 intruders break into your house. They're all armed. I have a 15-round standard capacity magazine. Under duress, the average shooting on target percentage is, I believe, under 25%. And I mean, this is law enforcement too. So 75% of the ammunition I have is already worthless because under duress I'm probably not going to hit anything. And then you have 3 assailants coming at you. So I would submit to you, is 15 rounds enough? I would, if it were me, I would rather have as much ammunition as I could possibly have to do the job, which is to protect my life.
Well, so how much is that? How much ammunition is that you think is necessary to protect your life?
This is why we believe in no restrictions. There shouldn't be a restriction.
There should be some restriction. Again, I go back to the stockpiling thing. It doesn't make sense to me.
Well, let me give you another example then. Say after the hurricanes, there were store owners who defended their properties with AR platform firearms, 30-round magazines. But they've got hordes of 10, 15, 20 people coming at them. So I would ask you, how many bullets do you think is enough?
I have no idea.
Now, it's a rhetorical question because that's precisely the point, is because every situation is different. You should, wouldn't you feel incredibly guilty if there was a 10-round magazine limit and 4 guys broke into a house and the woman goes click and she's killed? And I'm sure it's not hard to find cases where that has in fact happened. But this is precisely why our entire argument is that any limit that you impose is arbitrary.
Well, when we go back to how many carry concealed weapon holders, legitimate gun holders there are, and I think somebody yelled out about 3,000 in Rhode Island, that means most of us are not carrying. Wouldn't you agree with that statement?
I would say in Rhode Island, you're at the low end, and that's because of the issuing authority here. But if you look at states like Michigan, which are approaching a million...
Well, we're not concerned with Michigan here.
Well, no, but the point is...
Hang on. Please, one question and one answer. And also, Representative McKeny, I think that's not all gun owners. That's concealed carry holders.
Mm-hmm, that's true.
So the number of gun owners is many multitudes higher than that. So one question, one answer. So next question.
Okay. No, that's. I think we've got the gist of this anyway.
All right, Representative Knight.
Just to answer Rep. McAtee's question, I believe that New York has a 10-round limit. I'm looking at...
That's correct.
It's been held constitutional through their district court and their appeals court. And I think it's important to... I just want to throw out here as a comment, because I think it refutes some things you're saying from New York Rifle and Pistol Association versus Cuomo in 2013. The judge, specifically talking about the high-capacity rounds, in this case talked about, this was a whole, as you know, because I'm just seeing it, right. Just a whole raft of provisions designed to get at gun violence. The judge says evidence suggests that, quite simply, more people die when the shooter has a large-capacity magazine. And there's some words. And then similarly, a 2013 study of mass shootings over the past 4 years using data collected by the FBI found that shooters who used assault weapons, high-capacity magazines, or both, shot over twice as many people and killed 57% more people than shooters who did not use these weapons. So to answer your question, New York's 10, and it's been held as constitutional, even under the Heller framework. And certainly New York, I would submit, has made a public policy decision that a 10-round limit improves public safety, and the courts have held that up. And I would come right back to my initial comments when we first started this, is that, does your client have anything to say about the public health hazard presented by guns in the community, other than the standard argument of a good guy with a gun is the best protection against a bad guy with a gun? Is there anything that the NRA would support in terms of restricting access to firearms or restricting the flow of firearms in commerce to prevent killings by these weapons?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I guess labeling it a health care crisis or a public health crisis is where we diverge. You're talking about an object, possessing an object. For example, I have a safe full of firearms. Just don't hit anything other than paper and an occasional supper dinner, something like that. So those firearms, there's no public health crisis there. The crisis is criminals who disobey the law, who use firearms illegally. The crisis are the folks who are mentally ill, that maybe do some things that are not only unlawful but hard to comprehend. And on those issues, we've been part of the discussion with the NICS Improvement Act, for example, so that to say that we haven't done anything or we've turned a blind eye to some of this stuff is not entirely accurate. If you look at the number of firearms deaths in this country that are often reported, not to minimize any of it, it's tragic, it's horrible, but 60 to 70% of those are suicides. So maybe there are some underlying things that we should be looking at, rather than all the folks out here with yellow buttons who are lawful, capable gun owners in the state of Rhode Island. Maybe we should be looking at the folks that are at risk for suicide, who have drug and alcohol problems. And a lot of these things, keep in mind, are already illegal, and the folks are still getting their hands on firearms. And that goes back to questions that were asked earlier about enforcement of existing laws. And certainly that is something that we've fully advocated for.
Just one follow-up.
Representative Knight.
And if that's the case, then would your client support a meaningful connection between our mental health community and the licensing authority in our state to prevent folks who are not, because our law right now says you really have to be incapacitated by mental health issues in order to not have a gun. But would your community support some sort of meaningful connection to get at the people who some days are good and some days are bad? Maybe they've had a 3-day admission to the hospital and then they got out. And would your organization support some sort of meaningful record keeping with respect to serial numbers of firearms to track firearms that are used in crimes back to the original source and perhaps get at the straw buyers? Because if we could open up that part of the conversation, then a lot of these bills, which attempt to kind of nibble around the edge of gun violence, may not be necessary. I don't know. It's food for thought.
Before you answer that question, Representative Knight, so this is your first term, so perhaps you're unaware of this, but before you got here, there was an extensive study commission done by Representative Ruggiero on exactly that topic, and all parties participated in that, and legislation did come about as a result of that. Certainly, perhaps more can be done, and I think more should be done dealing with the question of mental health and guns, which I think is ultimately the real question, the real problem here. But just a little bit of background there. So with that, would you like to answer his question?
Yeah, I would answer that question by saying it's not a matter of will we become a part of those discussions. It's we have been. Now, because that's not part of my job function, I can't give you specifics, but I will tell you that in the discussions I've had with our folks, they do meet with these advocates. Ironically, some of the resistance actually comes from those groups because they say it has a chilling effect on people seeking counseling, and they don't want to do that. So there's a very fine line there. Now, in terms of the federal legislation that I referenced earlier on the NICS Improvement Act, we were supportive of a lot of the changes that were included in that, but there were a couple provisions that we did insist on. One is that there's an adjudication, meaning someone's doctor doesn't just say, well, I think Joe has a problem, let's go get his guns. It has to go before a judge, and if the medical professional wants to present evidence that he should not have firearms, then there's an adjudication. Those records are then submitted into the NICS database. The second component that we advocated for was a rights restoration process, because a lot of the mental health groups will even tell you that these aren't often permanent afflictions, that people do have recovery and they should be able to get their rights restored. Also, you need to be very careful what you classify as counseling or mental health. For example, what's marriage counseling? What is someone who gets treated for bulimia and anorexia? I guess what I'm saying are there are many avenues that one might go to a therapist, and at what point do we flag these people? And that's why we've insisted on a court process where there's an adjudication, and then later on there's a process available for rights restoration.
Representative Corvese, then Representative Coughlin.
Thank you. Darren, a couple of things. Representative Knight had said that New York State has a 10-round capacity, but you, in your conversation, your discussion, alluded to a 7-round.
Yes.
Was that a piece of legislation that failed?
No, Mr. Chairman, what was being referenced is 2013, the New York SAFE Act. It contained a number of provisions. It even outlawed turkey hunting shotguns because it was a thumbhole stock. They classified it as an assault weapon. It was a very draconian gun law from our standpoint. It had several provisions like that were beyond the pale. The 7-round restriction, New York was 10 prior to the introduction of that legislation and passage. They lowered it to 7. So in responding to the information that Representative Knight outlined for you, I would say it further demonstrates the shaky ground it's on, because of all the unreasonable components of the SAFE Act, the one thing that the Federal District Court in Buffalo did overturn was the 7-round limit reverting back to 10. Of all the components it had, it flagged the magazine capacity restriction.
Okay, so I understand that. What about the rest of the restrictions?
The rest of the restrictions were held in place. So there were 1 or 2 of them that were good, like, for example, that prevented someone from taking the life of a first responder. There was a shooting where a firefighter was shot by a guy sitting in wait. So there were components of the bill that were good. There weren't many. Most of it was very egregious and unworkable. Like, for example, there was an ammunition registry and database that required background checks on ammunition, which, by the way, is completely unworkable because you can only access the federal NICS database for firearms purchases. You can't access it for ammunition. So the governor came to us and said, well, guys, help us fix this. And we said, we told you you couldn't fix it. And so what the state was forced into doing is constructing their own database. And they found out that it was going to cost billions of dollars, be impossible to even construct, and as a result the governor entered into a memorandum of understanding which neutralized that. So the interesting thing about the New York SAFE Act, for as egregious as it was, most of the major components have either been invalidated or haven't been complied with. I already outlined the ammunition database and registration. We've talked about the magazine capacity. The other one was quote-unquote assault gun registration, and that they found after the time period had expired and people were forced to register their firearms, they found out that over a million, they estimated that there were over a million guns that would fit their assault weapon definition, and only about 40,000 firearms were registered by 24,000 owners. So you're looking at about 4% compliance. Connecticut found something very similar.
So going back to the 7 rounds, so the 10 round was just a way of trying to get down to the 7.
Rep. Corvisi, that's a very interesting story I have to tell you. I had the same thing when I was called into the majority leader's office and they said that they were interested in doing this bill on Monday. I said, how in the earth did you come up with 7? He said, well, we already have 10 and I want 5. And the difference is 7.5, and I don't like guns, so we're rounding down to 7. That's how they came up with 7.
Okay. So I think that shows the mindset, number one. Number two, also in your discussion earlier, I think you alluded to Chicago. You were talking about New Jersey and Chicago. Does Chicago have any municipal gun control laws?
Yes, I'm not an expert on Chicago, and I won't pretend to be, but it's my understanding that they have their own magazine capacity restriction.
Don't they have one of the highest homicide rates in the nation?
Yes, anybody that's turned on a television, yeah. It's okay. And I think last year actually shattered records. It annually hovered at about 500, and unfortunately I think it's spiked up to 700 plus.
So they're not really listening to those restrictions.
No.
Thank you.
Representative Coughlin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going through the list of bills that you quickly summarized and went through, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think you mentioned 5345, which would essentially ban anybody except law enforcement from carrying guns in schools in Rhode Island. It would ban anybody with a concealed weapon permit who was not law enforcement from going into the schools carrying a weapon. Do you have a position on that?
Yes, our position is that we're opposed to the legislation, and I know that a lot of speakers following me are going to comment more in depth on that. But basically, in a nutshell, the reason for that is this is nothing more than current law right now. There's no demonstrated problem with current law, so we don't believe in changing it. And second of all, where'd my train of thought go? I completely lost myself. Sorry. It happens. So our position on that was that there's not a problem with it, and our other point is this is gun-free zones, period, right? So firearms are prohibited in a lot of states in schools, and people go in there and will still do atrocious things. The only way that some of these events are going to be stopped is if somebody responsibly is concealing and carrying. So we're basically opposed to the legislation because it's current law. It's a solution in search of a problem. No one has demonstrated that there's ever been a problem with a concealed carry permit holder or anyone else in the state of Rhode Island doing anything, they shouldn't be with a firearm. So that's the gist of it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, I think that's probably enough for Darren for one night. We've got a lot of people to get through.